Yemen has documented a large spike in air raids recently as the U.S. government zeroes in on Ukraine. Even the UN has ended its expert panel on Yemen, which has been documenting human rights violations in the country. The media has also been largely silent on conflicts raging in the Middle East or dismissed the suffering as it's raged for decades. Remember this?
Now with the Russians marching in, it's changed the calculus entirely. Tens of thousands of people have tried to flee the city. There will be many more. People are hiding out in bomb shelters. But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Well, yesterday, MSNBC host Joy Reid gave her opinion on the matter. Let's listen to that.
Okay, let's face it. The world is paying attention because this is happening in Europe. If this was happening anywhere else, would we see the same outpouring of support and compassion? Well, we don't need to ask ourselves if the international response would be the same if Russia unleashed their horror on a country that wasn't white and largely Christian. Because Russia has already done it in Syria. This is a teachable moment for us in the media. We aren't afraid to call out our own industry. There is a lot of soul searching that we need to do in Western media about why some wars and lives seem to matter more than others, and why some refugees get the welcome mat while others get the wall.
Democratic strategist and council member at large of Montgomery County, Maryland, Will Jawando, and Newsweek contributor and business consultant Denise Long join us now to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, Denise, what did you make of Joy's comments? I think, look, it's not surprising that there's a lot of coverage of Russia invading its neighbor. Ukraine is a more developed, more important on the world scale nation. Russia is certainly a very important nation on the kind of world scale. So so she was going for some kind of gotcha there. I thought that, we only care because it's Europe, but this is a bigger news than some of these other conflicts, which doesn't mean we shouldn't cover those conflicts more as well. But I thought there was an obvious explanation to her question.
Yeah, you make a good point. It's Russia invading Ukraine, and of course the history of the USSR and the connection with Ukraine, as well as just the global dynamics around Russia and the United States and all. There's another element to what Joy Reid is talking about here, which is the calling out the media. There are some ways that we know that people of European descent and conflicts related to European descent are perhaps framed differently in the media than are others. But I think Joy Reid also needs to look at the ways she needs to be called out for how she and the folks she trotted out for over a year prior to the 2020 elections didn't actually provide unbiased, let's say, coverage to the descendants of slaves in America. They framed American descendants of slavery and the movement as Russian bots. They disparaged and defamed the movement in particular. So I think she needs to maybe apply that to herself as well as the Pan-Africanists that she brought onto her show.
Well, we sort of do have some other examples, right? Russia went after Chechnya, maybe less than 10 years ago, and we try. The United States is always trying to export its own particular racial typographies onto places where they don't necessarily fit, and so then you start asking the question: well, are Chechens white? And if Chechens are or are not white, how is that supposed to affect how we're supposed to judge the media's coverage or lack of coverage of that war? I think it's also easy to think about an alternative scenario. If Russia had invaded Japan, I think you'd be seeing the precise same coverage right now, wouldn't we, Will?
Yes, we don't have long enough for this segment. I'll just say that up front. So yes, obviously there's a lot going on here, but I do think the Joy's underlying point, which she doesn't make explicitly, is that white supremacy is global, and also anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-certain type of immigrant sentiment is xenophobia is rampant. I mean, you see it with the Africans and Ukrainians, Africans living in Ukraine, some who are actually citizens of Ukraine, trying to escape and being told, we want the real Ukrainians. That That could happen in the U.S. today. Get off the bus. We want the actual Americans. So I don't think it's quite right to say that we're exporting it. I think it exists, right? You think of where the transatlantic slave trade and the dehumanization of Black people started 500 years ago or so, from Europeans coming down to the continent of Africa and the Middle East and starting that export trade. Those concepts are alive and well in Europe and across the country. And it's a gradation. And the immigrant, the Christian Muslim dynamic is part of that. So there are a lot of crossways, but I think you look at this and absolutely the Ukrainians deserve support, outpouring. They deserve to be allowed into countries like it's happening, and all of that should happen, but it should happen for everyone, and it should be fair and equal. If you look at Poland, for example, when Syria was happening, Russia invading another country, Poland didn't let Syrians in, but they've taken 1 million Ukrainians. And they passed laws to say, discriminatory laws in Denmark are being proposed that Ukrainians shouldn't have to give up valuable jewelry when they come in, unlike other refugees, to help pay for their stay. So there's so many unequal standards here that do have their basis, I think, in the othering of people, whether based on religion or skin tone. And that is a conversation we should have. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing what we're doing with the Ukrainians. We absolutely should. It just means that everyone should be treated with that same kind of empathy and respect.
Well, and to
I
Ryan's
would question
point,
if we should, though. I'm sorry. I just wanted to push back on that a little bit. I would question if we should. Ukraine has a very long history of supporting Hitler, as well as its present, as Will alluded to, actions and embrace of neo-Nazism and anti-Black racism, African in this sense. So I think we should consider which immigrants are a fit for which country.
To say that Ukraine has a history of supporting Hitler would be like saying France has a history of supporting Hitler. Just because you had a few kind of French collaborators in the Vichy government doesn't mean that France supported Hitler. They were invaded, and there was a government that was propped up briefly, by the Nazi regime that included some collaborators, but that doesn't remotely mean that Ukraine kind of worked.
I mean, what about Germany?
It doesn't mean that the entire,
what about Germany?
100% of the population.
But yeah,
right.
I mean,
it doesn't mean that 100% of the population did. However, it does mean, and what we do know is that there is a present neo-Nazi embrace within Ukraine. And what we do see on camera, if we can trust anything we see on camera right now, what we do see is the way in which Africans are treated, as well as Indians, right? Non-white people are treated within Ukraine. And while I think that refugees have a space and place and should be taken care of, we should really look at the best fit for that and who we are bringing into the country and the ideologies that they bring with them. That's my point.
Where would you suggest they go with that? And by the way, I actually agree with you on the history of it. I do think that Ukraine has a particularly dark history when it comes to the Holocaust and World War II, more so than a lot of other countries in particular.
I mean, they got conquered and occupied.
No, the people turned on the Jews in that country. They were ratted out by their own neighbors. It was really bad.
If we're going to condemn countries for anti-Semitism, there isn't a country that's going to survive.
No, but
including
Ukraine
the one that we're sitting in right now.
There was a lot more of it, I would say, in Ukraine than there were in other countries.
To Will's point, yes.
So,
And it's the continuity of that, right? Because America also was, let's just call it like a slave-holding country. I'm seventh gen. My people were part of that. So it's not about deriding the history as much as it's looking at the extent to which the country has evolved from that history. What country would be a better fit for Ukrainians? First of all, for refugees, I think we need to keep people connected closer to their homelands so that they can reintegrate into their homelands once things are stabilized. And I do think that we need to consider, particularly in the United States, the social and political dynamics in which immigrants are coming and the ideologies that they bring. When we brought Nazis over here to help with our science and all of that, did we think about the impact that would have on the people that they were the non-white, right? The non-blonde folk that they were going to interact with and have power over. So I think those things are important, Kim, and I don't have a short answer to that, but I think that countries need to consider that. And we can't bring everybody who is struggling or in a war-torn country into the United States, and nor should we.
Will, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think, again, proximity matters. my talk is more about what are we doing with aid? What are we doing with not necessarily where people go, but how we treat people? If you look at that reporter, who is not a Nazi, but he has bought into, subconsciously or not, that some places have conflict, and that's expected, and we are okay with it to some extent, and some places shouldn't have that conflict because we think that they are more civilized, to use his own word, that it's more stable. And that's just not true. It hasn't been true over the course of history. It's a short view of history. Countries go in and out over thousands of years. We could have that long discussion. And I just think that pervasive view is damaging to people in these refugee countries across the world. And it's damaging to the sentiment here in the U.S. about what we will do to support people wherever they go. And I think that's a problem. And it's something that Joy was getting at. It's a long conversation. It's something we should tackle.
Will Jawando, Denise Long, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, the debate on free speech on college campuses reignited with a recent op-ed in the New York Times by student Emma Camp, and she will join us next to discuss her viral op-ed.